At 10:20 on Tuesday night, with less than 2 hours left on the clock before 50% tariffs hit almost every major Canadian export to the United States, Donald Trump posted a message on Truth Social that changed the entire trajectory of the story. He said he had a deal, he said he was pausing the tariffs, and across Ottawa, inside the office of Prime Minister Mark Carney, officials were not celebrating. They were choosing their words with visible caution. That contrast, a triumphant post from Washington and a guarded, careful statement from Ottawa, is the real story here, and it is far more complicated and far more interesting than a simple word like surrender can capture. To understand what happened this week, you have to go back more than a year, because this did not start as a tariff deadline. It started as a question about whether Canada would continue to exist as an independent country at all. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in early 2025, he did something no American president in the modern era had done to a close ally. He began floating, publicly and repeatedly, the idea that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. He described the border between the two countries as, in his words, an artificial line, a bureaucratic accident rather than a sovereign boundary. For most of Canada's political class, this was dismissed at first as rhetorical bluster, the kind of provocative talk Trump was known for on the campaign trail. But it did not stop. It continued into the spring, through the Canadian federal election, and it became, according to multiple outlets covering that campaign, one of the defining issues that shaped the vote. Mark Carney, a former central banker who had run the Bank of Canada and later the Bank of England, entered Canadian politics at exactly this moment, and he built his campaign for Prime Minister almost entirely around standing up to Trump's threats. According to the Financial Times and other outlets covering the April 2025 election, Carney won that vote explicitly on what was described as an anti-Trump ticket, positioning himself as the leader who would not bend. His Liberal Party fell short of an outright majority in Parliament, but Carney emerged as Prime Minister with a mandate built on resistance to American pressure. The first real test of that mandate came fast. In May 2025, barely weeks after his government was sworn in, Carney traveled to the White House for his first face-to-face meeting with Trump. According to Euronews and Wire coverage of that visit, a reporter in the room asked Trump directly whether he still wanted to annex Canada. Trump said yes, he was still interested, and he again described the border as arbitrary. It was, by any normal diplomatic standard, an extraordinary thing to hear a sitting American president say about a G7 ally in front of that ally's own prime minister. Carney's response in the room was measured, but his public message afterward was blunt. Canada, he said, is not for sale, not now, not ever. That set the tone for the following 14 months. Trade tensions between the two countries did not ease. They hardened. Reporting from CNBC and other financial outlets tracked a series of escalating tariff moves through the back half of 2025, including a jump in duties on Canadian goods from 25% to 35% in August of that year. Underneath the day-to-day headlines, the broader trading relationship between the world's largest bilateral trade partnership was being reshaped, proclamation by proclamation, threat by threat. Then came Davos. In January 2026, Carney addressed the World Economic Forum, and what he said there is widely regarded, according to Wikipedia's summary of that speech and contemporaneous reporting from CTV and Reuters, as a veiled but unmistakable rebuke of the Trump administration's approach to trade and territorial ambition. Carney spoke about what he called American hegemony and warned that great powers were increasingly using economic integration itself as a weapon against smaller states. He did not name Trump directly in every line, but nobody in that room, and nobody watching afterward, mistook who he was talking about. The reaction was immediate, and for a World Economic Forum audience, unusually emotional. Carney received a standing ovation, an outcome so rare at that venue that multiple outlets flagged it as extraordinary on its own. Trump did not let it go unanswered. Speaking at the same Davos gathering the very next day, he pushed back hard, telling the audience, according to reporting cited around his remarks, that Canada lives because of the United States. It was a blunt, almost dismissive line, and it was followed by concrete consequences, not just words. Trump rescinded an invitation he had extended to Canada to join the founding charter of what his administration was calling the Board of Peace, an invitation Ottawa had not yet formally accepted. And in a second escalation just days later, Trump threatened a full 100% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, not over autos, not over dairy, but over something else entirely, a trade arrangement Carney's government had just reached with China. That China story matters because it shows this conflict was never only about trade numbers, it was about geopolitical alignment. Earlier in January 2026, Carney had made his first official visit to China, meeting with President Xi Jinping, and the two governments reached an agreement allowing an initial batch of 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market at a reduced tariff rate of 6.1%. in exchange for China lowering its own tariffs on Canadian canola and other agricultural products. To Washington, even this modest sector-specific rollback looked like the beginning of Canada drifting toward Beijing. Trump's language on Truth Social was ferocious. According to Reuters reporting from that weekend, Trump wrote that China would, in his words, eat Canada alive and completely devour it, warning of the destruction of Canadian businesses and what he called the country's social fabric. In a separate post the same weekend, he referred to Carney not as Prime Minister, but as Governor, a title Trump had also used for former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, a deliberate and pointed reference to his repeated suggestion that Canada become the 51st state. Carney's response to that provocation is worth sitting with, because it tells you something about the pattern that would repeat again this week. He did not escalate rhetorically. According to CBC and Fox Business coverage from late January 2026, Carney told reporters plainly that Canada had no intention of pursuing a full free trade agreement with China or with any other non-market economy, pointing out that under the Canada-United-States-Mexico agreement, known as CUSMA on the Canadian side and USMCA on the American side, Ottawa had committed not to pursue such deals without notifying its two continental trading partners first. He characterized the China arrangement as narrow, a correction of specific sector issues, not a pivot in alignment. It was a careful, technocratic answer from a former central banker, delivered without theatrics, and it stood in sharp contrast to Trump's social media broadsides. That contrast between Trump's maximalist public threats and Carney's calm, procedural, almost bureaucratic pushback is, according to analysts quoted across multiple outlets at the time, exactly the dynamic that has defined this entire relationship. Which brings the story to this summer and to the tariff deadline that made headlines this week. Before getting to July's proclamations, it's worth understanding just how much back and forth had already happened between Washington and Ottawa by that point, because this was never a single dispute. It was a running conflict with its own history of escalation and de-escalation. According to Canada's own Department of Finance, Ottawa first imposed counter tariffs on American goods back in March 2025, in direct response to the initial round of U.S. duties. By late August 2025, in recognition that most Canadian goods were still entering the United States tariff-free under CUSMA, Canada removed the bulk of those counter tariffs on U.S. imports. But not all of them. Ottawa kept its own retaliatory tariffs in place specifically on American steel, aluminum, and automobiles because, as the Canadian government explained in its own public statements, those were exactly the sectors where Washington had refused to grant CUSMA-compliant goods any exemption at all. Through the fall of 2025, Carney's government went further, announcing new measures in November to protect and, in the government's own phrase, transform Canada's steel and lumber industries, including lower tariff rate quotas on foreign steel and a new 25% global tariff on steel derivative products that took effect just after Christmas, on December 26, 2025. A parallel Buy Canadian procurement policy required government contracts above a $250,000 threshold to use Canadian steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber wherever possible. Trump, for his part, kept adding pressure of his own in that same window. In October 2025, according to trade law summaries from Blake's, his administration imposed a new 10% tariff on imports of Canadian softwood timber and lumber, on top of existing anti-dumping duties, along with a 25% tariff on upholstered wooden furniture and kitchen cabinets, rates that were set to climb even higher, to 30% and 50% respectively at the start of 2026. And then, in the fall of 2025, the entire relationship nearly collapsed over something that had nothing to do with tariffs directly. According to trade industry coverage from Construct Connect's front page year in review, the government of Ontario ran a roughly $75 million advertising campaign across American television stations that used archival audio and video of former President Ronald Reagan speaking critically about tariffs back in 1987. Trump's reaction was immediate and absolute. He posted that, because of what he called Ontario's egregious behavior, all trade negotiations with Canada were, in his words, hereby terminated. Talks did eventually resume, but the episode is a useful reminder of just how personally and unpredictably Trump has treated this relationship. A single provincial ad campaign was enough, in his framing, to blow up months of federal negotiating work overnight, and Carney's government spent weeks afterward on what outlets described as damage control just to get both countries back to the table. It's also worth noting that several Canadian provinces beyond Ontario built their own responses into this fight. According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, provincial governments introduced measures ranging from expanded contingency funds — Alberta alone added $2 billion to its budget for tariff response — to Buy Alberta and similar province-level marketing campaigns encouraging consumers to favor domestic products, alongside calls to reduce interprovincial trade barriers, so Canadian businesses could lean on each other rather than the American market while the dispute dragged on. On the political side, inside Canada, None of this happened in a vacuum. Carney's Liberals faced, and continue to face, a conservative opposition led by Pierre Poilievre. In the tightness of that political race, the two men were locked in a close contest through the back half of 2025, has been part of why Carney has had so little room to be seen conceding ground publicly, even when his negotiators were making real progress behind closed doors in Washington. By July 20th, 2026 then, this was already a relationship that had survived one near-total collapse, multiple rounds of tariffs and counter-tariffs, and months of stop-and-start negotiation. That is the context in which Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law so old and so rarely invoked that its use here was itself treated as newsworthy. The 3 proclamations targeted Canadian motor vehicles, dairy products, and alcoholic beverages specifically, framed by the administration as a response to what it called Canadian discrimination against American commerce in those sectors. But, as legal analysts at Blake's noted, the actual scope of the new 50% duties extended well beyond those 3 named sectors, sweeping in a much broader range of Canadian products. The tariffs were set to take effect 30 days after signing, which put the deadline squarely at August 19, 2026, just after midnight. The list of goods caught up in that deadline became, in its own strange way, one of the more talked about details of the whole standoff. According to The Hill and the American Farm Bureau Federation's own reporting, the roughly $20 billion in Canadian exports facing the new 50% rate included everything from alcohol to furniture to dairy products, and in a detail that multiple outlets seized on because it captured the almost absurd breadth of the measure, hockey sticks. Cameron Castillo, an associate economist with the American Farm Bureau Federation, told the Ag Information Network that the tariffs, while carrying some important exemptions, would create real difficulty for American farmers and ranchers too, since Canadian retaliation was always a live possibility. Certain sectors were carved out of the new duties entirely, energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals among them. But for everything else, the clock was now running. As August began, both sides signaled they wanted to avoid the deadline actually landing, but neither wanted to be seen as folding. On August 6th, according to reporting tracked by trade compliance outlets, Carney told reporters Canada's negotiators were working to avert the tariffs, but he added, with characteristic understatement, that they would simply have to see where. In the days that followed, Carney's language shifted subtly but noticeably. He said Ottawa wanted what he called a comprehensive win-win agreement covering not just autos, dairy, and alcohol, but steel, aluminum, forestry, and what he termed all of Canada's strategic sectors. He did not rule out retaliatory tariffs of Canada's own. And in the final stretch before the deadline, he signaled publicly that it might be, in his words, time to get tougher, while at the same time explicitly ruling out one specific lever. He would not use Canadian energy exports as a bargaining chip, a red line that speaks to how central energy security is to the broader Canada-U.S. relationship, even amid open conflict everywhere else. Behind the podium statements, the actual negotiating work was happening in Washington, not Ottawa. Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, along with Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette, had been stationed in Washington for more than a week as the deadline approached. According to BNN Bloomberg and CP24, the two met directly with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick on the Monday before the deadline. A short statement released afterward from a spokesperson for LeBlanc's office described a 1-hour virtual session over the preceding weekend as, in their word, constructive, language that, in the deliberately flat vocabulary of trade diplomacy, usually means real, if incomplete, progress. LeBlanc's office said the two negotiating teams had taken stock of the work completed so far, and that discussions were continuing. Then, on Monday, Carney said something that CTV News confirmed directly. He expected to speak with Trump by phone before the Wednesday deadline hit. He described the negotiations, in French, as very intense and very delicate, and he said his government had a contingency plan ready that would, in his words, cover all eventualities if the tariffs were imposed anyway. That call happened. According to the Prime Minister's office, Carney and Trump spoke again the following afternoon, their second conversation of the week, about the ongoing negotiations, though Carney's office declined to elaborate on specifics. That brings the story to Tuesday night, the actual climax of this particular chapter, and the moment the video title is really pointing to. With less than 2 hours remaining before the 50% tariffs were due to take effect at 1 minute past midnight, Trump posted on Truth Social that he was pausing the new duties. Multiple outlets, UPI, Al Jazeera, NBC News, and CP24 among them, confirmed the timing and the substance of that post almost simultaneously. Trump wrote that he had paused the 50% tariffs against Canada that had been scheduled to take effect, and he framed the pause as the result of a pending trade deal, declaring in his post that the two sides, in his words, had a deal. Initial reporting described the pause as lasting 3 days. Al Jazeera's subsequent coverage pinned down the actual date more precisely, reporting that the suspension runs until August 22nd, with both governments confirming the tariffs were being delayed rather than canceled outright. And Trump himself noting the agreement was subject to what he called the fine print being finalized. Now compare that to what came out of Ottawa. Carney's statement, released shortly after Trump's post, struck a very different tone. He acknowledged that the two countries had made what he called substantial progress. But he did not declare victory, and he did not use the word deal the way Trump had. Instead, Carney said plainly that there was, in his words, important work still to be done. That is not the language of a leader who believes the fight is over. It is the language of a leader who has learned over 14 months of dealing with this particular American president that a social media announcement and a signed binding agreement are two very different things, and that the safest posture, politically and diplomatically, is to underpromise until the ink is actually dry. This is really the core of what people are calling Carney's countermove, and it is worth being precise about what that phrase does and does not mean, because precision is the whole point of a story like this. Carney did not stage some dramatic confrontation. He did not threaten to walk away from the table. What he did, consistently across more than a year of pressure from Washington, was refuse to let Trump's maximalist rhetoric set the terms of Canada's public response. When Trump threatened 100% tariffs over the China arrangement, Carney did not escalate. He explained calmly and in detail exactly what the deal did and did not do, and cited Canada's specific treaty obligations under CUSMA to make the case that Ottawa had not crossed any line. When Trump declared a deal on Tuesday night, Carney did not simply echo him. He added the caveat that mattered, the one about unfinished work, protecting his own government from being boxed in by an announcement it had not fully signed off on. That pattern, steady, procedural, unwilling to be baited into either capitulation or confrontation, is what negotiators and Canadian officials, according to people close to the talks cited across this week's coverage, believe has actually kept Ottawa's leverage intact through more than a year of escalating pressure. It's a strategy that trades one kind of political risk for another. A louder, more combative posture might play better domestically in the short term, giving Canadians a more satisfying villain narrative to rally around. But a former central banker, like Carney, has spent his career reading markets and counterparties, not crowds. And every public signal out of his office through this entire saga suggests he sees more value in staying credible with negotiators in Washington and with the businesses on both sides of the border watching for signs of where this actually lands than in scoring a rhetorical win against Trump on social media, a platform Trump will always control more effectively than any foreign leader ever could. It is also worth being honest, in the same breath, about what remains genuinely uncertain here, because a responsible account of this story cannot pretend to know more than the record actually shows. As of this week, no outlet, not Reuters, not the Associated Press, not CBC, not any of the wire services tracking this closely, has published the actual text or detailed terms of whatever arrangement Trump and Carney's teams reached in Washington. We know the tariffs are paused until August 22. We know Trump has publicly called it a deal. We know Carney has publicly declined to use that word without qualification. Everything else, what Canada may have conceded on dairy, autos, or alcohol, what, if anything, the United States is offering in return, whether the pause becomes permanent or simply resets the clock on another confrontation, remains unresolved and frankly unverifiable from where things stand right now. Anyone telling you they know exactly what was agreed in that room is going further than the reporting actually supports. It also helps to step back and ask why this particular standoff, over roughly $20 billion in goods, generated this much attention in the first place. Because on the scale of the overall Canada-U.S. trading relationship, one of the largest bilateral trade relationships anywhere in the world, $20 billion is a meaningful but not civilization-ending number. Part of the answer is symbolic. Section 338 had never been used this way before Trump's July proclamations, according to trade analysts writing for outlets covering the tariff calculator and compliance space. Its use signaled that the administration was willing to reach for legal tools that had sat dormant for nearly a century in order to apply maximum pressure on a neighbor and ally. Part of the answer is about precedent. If Trump could successfully force Ottawa into a concession-heavy deal under threat of 50% tariffs on hockey sticks and cement, it would set a template for how the administration might treat other trading partners facing their own deadlines. And part of the answer, frankly, is about the sheer novelty of watching a sitting American president speak this way about Canada specifically. A country that has, for the better part of a century, been treated in Washington as close to an extension of the American economy itself, not an adversary to be pressured with century-old tariff statutes. It also helps to understand why dairy and autos specifically became such persistent flashpoints, because neither is arbitrary. Canada operates what is known as a supply management system for dairy, eggs, and poultry, a decades-old structure of production quotas and tariff rate quotas that keeps domestic prices stable for Canadian farmers, but caps how much American dairy can enter the Canadian market before steep tariffs kick in. American dairy producers and successive U.S. trade representatives have objected to that system for years, arguing it locks them out of a market they should have freer access to under CUSMA. When Trump's July proclamations singled out dairy by name, it wasn't a random target. It was Washington reaching for one of the oldest, most persistent grievances in the entire bilateral relationship and attaching a 50% hammer to it. Autos carry their own complexity because the North American auto industry doesn't really operate as two separate national industries at all. A single vehicle can see its components cross the Canada-U.S. border several times during assembly. Engines built in one country, transmissions in another, finished units rolling off lines in Ontario, using parts stamped in Michigan and Ohio, which is exactly why a blanket 50% tariff on Canadian-made vehicles doesn't just hurt Canadian auto workers, it raises costs for American-based manufacturers who depend on that same integrated supply chain. The Greenland connection is a smaller thread in this story, but it's a real one, and it helps explain the mood inside the Trump administration heading into this year's confrontations with Canada. Trump spent much of 2025 and early 2026 also pushing to acquire Greenland from Denmark, another sovereignty dispute involving a close American ally. And Carney was among the world leaders who publicly criticized that push. Fox News coverage from January 2026 noted that rising tension between Washington and Ottawa followed directly on the heels of Carney's Greenland criticism, with a former special envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, weighing in publicly on the connection between the two disputes. The through line, as several analysts have pointed out, is consistent. An American president willing to treat the territorial boundaries and sovereign choices of close allies as open questions, and a Canadian prime minister who has made pushing back on exactly that, framing the central premise of his time in office. Zoom out far enough, and the sheer scale of what's actually at stake becomes clearer too. Canada and the United States are, by the Canadian government's own description, each other's largest trading partners, with goods and services worth roughly $2.5 billion crossing the border every single day. That is the backdrop against which a $20 billion tariff dispute has to be understood, not as the whole relationship, but as a flashpoint inside a trading partnership, so large and so integrated that both governments have strong incentives, alongside all the political theater, to eventually find their way back to something resembling stability. There is also a domestic political dimension inside Canada that shapes how all of this lands. Carney did not just win an election on standing up to Trump. His entire governing coalition, built out of a Liberal Party that fell short of an outright majority, depends to some degree on being seen as tough enough to hold the line against American pressure without triggering an actual economic collapse for Canadian exporters, auto workers, dairy farmers, and distillers who would bear the immediate cost of a 50% tariff wall. That is an almost impossible balance to strike. Cave too visibly, and Carney risks looking like exactly the kind of leader his own campaign promised. Canadians he would never be. Refuse to bend at all, and Canadian industries, from Ontario's auto plants to British Columbia's forestry sector to Quebec's dairy producers, absorb tariffs that could genuinely damage entire regional economies. Every public statement out of Ottawa this week, including Carney's careful phrase about important work still to be done, has to be read with that domestic tightrope in mind. There's one more piece of context worth adding, because it changes how you should read Trump's Tuesday night announcement specifically. Trade lawyers tracking this relationship, including the team at Blake's, have noted throughout 2025 and 2026 that a striking number of the tariff actions coming out of the Trump administration have relied on emergency and discretionary legal authorities. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, now Section 338, rather than the standard, slower investigative processes trade law usually requires. That matters for two reasons. First, it means these tariffs can be imposed, paused, or reinstated almost entirely at the president's discretion, with minimal procedural friction, which is part of why the deadline could move so fast and so unpredictably in the final 48 hours. Second, it means some of these actions have faced legal challenges over whether the underlying authority was ever properly invoked in the first place. Canadian trade compliance guidance has flagged that businesses which paid certain tariffs under one of those emergency powers between February 2025 and February 2026 may now be eligible for refunds, because tariffs charged without clear legal authority don't automatically stay valid just because they were collected. None of that resolves the current standoff, but it's a useful reminder that even the legal foundation underneath some of these tariff threats has been genuinely contested, not just the politics surrounding them. For American consumers and businesses, the stakes of this standoff are not purely abstract either. Canada remains one of the top two trading partners for the United States overall, And tariffs at 50% on goods ranging from Canadian dairy to Canadian assembled vehicles do not simply disappear into some abstract trade ledger. They show up, eventually, in the price of groceries, in the cost of vehicles built with cross-border supply chains that run through plants in Ontario and Michigan alike, and in the margins of American distributors, who rely on Canadian alcohol and lumber. That is part of why the American Farm Bureau Federation's own economist flagged concern about the tariffs, even though they were framed by the administration as a tool to defend American producers. Retaliation, even partial retaliation, is never one-directional in a relationship this deeply integrated. So where does this actually leave things as of today? The 50% tariffs that were set to take effect just after midnight on Wednesday, August 19th, are paused, not canceled, with that pause confirmed by multiple outlets to run until August 22nd. Trump has publicly called the outcome a deal. Carney has publicly deliberately declined to call it finished. Canadian and American negotiating teams, led on the Canadian side by Dominic LeBlanc and Janice Charette, and on the American side by Jameson Greer and Howard Lutnick, remain engaged in what both sides have described, using almost identical language, as intense and delicate talks. And underneath all of it, the deeper structural conflict that has defined this relationship since early 2025, Trump's repeated suggestion that Canada's sovereignty itself is negotiable, and Carney's equally repeated refusal to accept that framing, has not gone anywhere. It has simply been paused alongside the tariffs for 3 more days. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about exactly where this account comes from, because that transparency is the difference between analysis and speculation. The background on Trump's annexation rhetoric in the 2025 Canadian election draws on reporting from the Financial Times, Euronews, and Wire coverage of Carney's first White House visit. The Davos speech and Trump's response, including the rescinded Board of Peace invitation and the initial 100% tariff threat over the China arrangement, are documented in contemporaneous reporting, referenced through Wikipedia's own sourced summary of that speech, alongside direct coverage from Reuters, CBC, Fox Business, and Fox News from late January 2026. The China-Canada electric vehicle agreement and Carney's specific comments about CUSMA obligations come from Reuters, the Associated Press, and CBC's direct quotations of Carney's remarks to reporters. The July 20th Section 338 proclamations are confirmed through legal analysis published by the law firm Blake's, which specializes in Canadian trade law, and cross-referenced against coverage from The Hill and the Ag Information Network's interview with the American Farm Bureau Federation's Cameron Castillo. This week's deadline coverage, the LeBlanc-Charette meetings with Greer and Lutnick, Carney's phone calls with Trump, and the final Tuesday night pause are drawn from BNN Bloomberg, CP24, UPI, Al Jazeera, and NBC News, all of which independently confirmed the timing and the broad strokes of the announcement within hours of it happening. What remains contested or simply unknown, the detailed terms of the pending deal, whether it will hold past August 22nd, and what either side actually conceded behind closed doors, has not been reported by any of these outlets, and this script has deliberately avoided guessing at it. What do you think is actually happening behind that pause? Is this genuine progress toward a lasting agreement between two deeply intertwined economies, or is it simply another 3-day delay in a pattern that has now repeated itself in one form or another for more than a year? Does Carney's refusal to call this a finished deal strike you as smart caution from someone who has learned exactly how this administration operates, or is it something else entirely? Leave your read on it in the comments. This is very much a live story, and the next update could come before the weekend is out. If you want to actually understand where this goes next instead of just reacting to the next headline, subscribe now, because this channel breaks down every twist in the Canada-U.S. relationship the moment it happens, with the sourcing to back it up. Hit the notification bell so you're not relying on an algorithm to tell you when August 22 arrives, and this deadline either gets its permanent deal or gets extended again. And if this breakdown actually helped you understand the difference between what Trump announced and what Carney actually agreed to, share it with someone who's only seen the headline version of this story. Because the gap between the two is, honestly, the whole story. Thanks for watching. We'll be back the moment this deal either closes or falls apart.